But I would like to introduce, if you haven't met him, if you have not seen him present, you're in for a treat because he's phenomenal. Travis Wright, our board president. He is a historic preservation hero. He's an award winner. He's an author with his wife, Kate. And I am thrilled to introduce you to him, let him speak. He is a great presenter, so here we go. One more thing, because Travis is the board president and he wants us to raise as much money as possible, please feel free to get up and check your bids. There are a few items that have not been bid on, and so if you keep an eye on those, there's a lovely painting I've had my eye on that hasn't been bid on. But so please feel free to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shanna. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Sunday at the Ranch at the Be Lazy 2. Thank you to Janet and Wendy for letting us use your timeless property with wonderful views of the Continental Divide. Thank you as well to the GCHA board, volunteers, staff, sponsors, and for all of you for coming today. This is Rollins Pass, Stories Behind the Legends. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll begin with a brief introduction, why it's me standing up here today rather than someone else when it comes to Rollins Pass. We'll look at Rollins Pass as a great gate. We'll dive into some legends and near losses for the community. And we'll look at how GCHA actively advocates for our community. So as Shanna indicated, my name is Travis. I'm the vice chair of the Gilpin County Historic Preservation Commission. And in Grand County, where I live here in Fraser, I'm president of the board of the Grand County Historical Association. My wife, Kate, over there, and I have done a lot when it comes to Rollins Pass. A lot of academic research and publications. We've given presentations all across Colorado, and we've written 3 total publications. Our second book came out earlier this summer. Both books are actually here today, and I'll be taking questions and signing books afterwards outside. Kate and I have also found the oldest human-made artifact ever discovered on Rollins Pass. It clocks in at 11,000 years old. And it's no accident that we found it atop Rollins Pass, because Rollins Pass has been identified as a sacred area for both the Ute as well as for the Arapaho tribes. So the historian Marshall Sprague once spoke about mountain passes serving as great gates, funneling humans and animals from one side to the other. And Rollins Pass absolutely fits the definition of what a great gate is. Let's take a look. Whether you call it Rollins Pass, Corona Pass, Boulder Pass, or Rollinsville Pass, we're speaking about the same area, at least for the purposes of today's presentation. The pass sits squarely on the Continental Divide and is shared among Grand, Boulder, and Gilpin counties. It's located east of Winter Park and west of Rollinsville. And I define Rollins Pass more or less by these geographical boundaries that are being drawn right now. Contained within thousands and thousands and thousands of years of use by the Native American, and before that, the Paleo-Indian. But it wasn't until the 1860s, 1870s, when John Quincy Adams Rollins built a toll wagon road up and over the Continental Divide and into Middle Park, present-day Winter Park at Fraser. Then in the 1880s, there were early attempts at running rails over the Continental Divide. Those met with failure, but nevertheless succeeded in changing the landscape ever so slightly. And it wasn't until 1904 when David Moffat built his Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific Railway Hill Route into present-day Winter Park. Perhaps a bit inefficient, which is why in 1928 there was a lot of celebration when the Moffat Tunnel opened under a shoulder of James Peak for rail traffic. Several decades later, fiber optic communications can be found on the wall of that rail tunnel, beginning to change the definition of what a great gate can look like in the 21st century. Not only is it just humans and animals migrating from one side to the other, but pulses of light as well as water. So the pioneer bore for the Moffat Tunnel was repurposed as a water tunnel to send water from the west to the east. In 1936, the rails over Rollins Pass were removed, freeing the automobile 2 decades later to travel from one side to the other in 1956. It's no longer a complete thoroughfare, so folks going up one side need to go back down that same side. The current route is highlighted there in green. In 1948, we have the highest rotating airway beacon in North America at over 12,000 feet placed atop Rollins Pass. This was to guide primitive airline travel from one mountain peak to the other. It's been since decommissioned, but it's still part of the Rollins Pass story. In 1969, from Grand into Boulder County, we have a high-pressure natural gas pipeline. It's actually still there, and it's still in operation today. Running north to south and south to north, the Continental Divide Trail of the Americas. And then over all of this, we have an en route airway radial. If you've flown in or out of Denver International Airport, you've probably been on this radial known as V8. And because it's really 4 nautical miles on either side of that center line, it looks more like this. So Rollins Pass really is that great gate that historian Sprague spoke of. We have 2 wilderness areas here too. To the north, the Indian Peaks Wilderness, and to the south, the James Peak Wilderness area. So that's a look at where Rollins Pass is. Let's dive into some of those stories behind the legends. The first one is a roundhouse at Tolland. For those who aren't familiar, a roundhouse is essentially a garage for locomotive equipment to be housed. So David Moffat built a little depot in lower downtown Denver. His goal ultimately was to stretch to the shining waters of the Pacific Ocean. So we've already left Denver. We're getting towards the town of Tolland, where Rollins Pass East really begins. So you can see here in these old photographs, 3 distinct layers of track. This is known as Giant's Ladder because a giant trying to cross the Continental Divide, those mountains, would need a ladder of such impossible height. So the train would travel that as well, spiraling up and gaining additional elevation as it climbed to the Continental Divide. This is a look at the first leg of Giant's Ladder. You can see that track precipitously placed on the edge of the mountainside, and gorgeous, timeless Tolland, Colorado to the right. So why am I telling you this story today? A couple reasons. This was part of a spirited debate as we looked at a historic property in Gilpin County for the Historic Preservation Commission. There was a staff report that said that there was a roundhouse, and a seasoned intellectual debate kicked off if there was one or not. So I dug into historic photographs, historic newspaper articles to prove the case, and so this is some of that research here. So it was the night of Tuesday, April 12th, 1910, and as the steamboat pilot says, a 2-stall roundhouse was completely destroyed by fire. The Yampa leader echoes that same sentiment a few days later, and also adds that railroad equipment was damaged to the tune of several $1,000s. However, it ends on a really positive note that a replacement roundhouse would be constructed later that year. Here are some photographs. They may be tough to see from the back, so I'll speak about them. At the very bottom is a roundhouse from Wisconsin. Doesn't really apply here, but it does show that a roundhouse need not be round. They can be square, they can be rectangular, and the roundhouse here in Wisconsin is a 3-stall roundhouse. The one in Tolland was 2 stalls, and you can see in this historic photograph at the very top of the screen, a pretty sizable structure there, whereas the middle photo, that roundhouse has disappeared, and you can see what looks like charred remains. So I believe it was taken shortly after 1910. But that newspaper article that ended with that optimistic note, they did rebuild that roundhouse sometime between 1910 and 1919, because what we're looking at here is a historic map showing the railroad, its features, where it went. And right in the center of Tolland is that roundhouse from 1919. So this map is really important for a lot of reasons, so keep that tucked in the back of your mind as we proceed. Next, as we're continuing up and over the Continental Divide, we get to features like Needle's Eye Tunnel, the Devil's Slide Trestles, Rifle Sight Notch, and many others. And part of historic preservation is preserving images, restoring images that are yellowed, faded, cracking, so that we can learn even more and preserve those for the next generation. What you're seeing, or what you're about to see, is just a 3-minute or so video clip from the 30-minute documentary that Kate and I produced earlier this year for the launch of our second book. So please enjoy it.
Every single historic photograph in our book was scanned at incredibly high resolution to reveal details about each scene and to uncover even more about the Rollins Pass story. We wanted to showcase a few images in particular from the collection of the Tyler family of Charles Crocker's original photographs that play an important role in really making our book something truly special. Prior to our efforts, this is an image that was publicly available. If you were to zoom in, you'd see a heavily pixelated face. After having had the honor of scanning from the treasured original, an unprecedented level of detail can be found in that same area of the photograph. We now see a young man staring back at us from nearly 120 years ago. Elsewhere in the publicly available image, this was a look at, well, something in the background of the scene. We now know it's clearly a tripod with a wooden case resting on the ground that likely contains a theodolite. The condition of the photograph has deteriorated since it was first developed, and there was a considerable amount of dust, smudges, and more that needed correction. 125 hours and a lot of eye drops later, we're pleased to share that timeless and phantasmagorical image with you now. Here's another. Prior to today, this was the best resolution available of a photograph crucial to telling the Rollins Pass story. Blurred figures are performing some sort of task. With exceptional technology and effort, we can now see the detail in their rugged faces as they unload timbers for what would become the Devil's Slide Trestle. This is the original look at the scanned photograph, and after several weeks of effort, this wonderful scene comes alive. One more. This is a classic photograph used on Rollins Pass postcards and memorabilia for decades. And it's the original photograph. As you can see, there's some imperfections, ink splotches in the sky, bright spots at the bottom and on the right. So with delicate care and diligence and working with that image at nearly 8,000% of normal, it can be revealed for just how dazzling it truly is. And the level of detail advances the Rollins Pass story just a little bit more. The intricate framing over the portal to Tunnel 33 is visible, as well as the height of the individual standing in the entrance.
So we've made our way into Grand County now. We've crossed over the Continental Divide, we've passed Rifle Sight Notch Trestle, and now we get to the town site of Arrow, where in just a few weeks we will have our annual gold rush. Everyone comes up here, the leaf peepers, to look at the ostentatious showing of yellows, oranges, and reds that catch fire on the hillside. There's also historic claims for gold here on the lower portions of Rollins Pass as well. This is known as the Louis and Lupton placers, and placer mining doesn't involve any sort of infrastructure that you would see with tunnels or adits. It's actually alluvial mining extraction. So here's an overhead view. You can see the main road here is US Highway 40. Going underneath US Highway 40 is the Fraser River. That's the source for the placer. You also have the Fraser Trail. And then the curved route is the initial grade of Rollins Pass here on the west side in Grant County. I've overlaid the Louis and Lupton placer boundaries. It still exists. Really neat stuff. We also have a modern day gold rush, and this is the final chapter of the stories behind the legends that I'd like to share with you this afternoon. So extra special thanks to a Grand County legend herself, Karen Vance, because in 2020, during COVID, our museums were struggling quite a bit. We had to shutter our doors for quite a while because of COVID protocols. When we reopened, we couldn't reopen at full capacity, and so there was a funding gap, and Karen Vance filled that funding gap for us by donating this painting and allowing us to raffle it off to a lucky couple. So part of my job as the Rollins Pass resident expert was to write newspaper articles every so often, raising awareness not only about the prehistory and history of Rollins Pass, but also about the fundraiser and the hard work that Karen was doing to save our museums. One day I was waiting for the next newspaper article to drop, and I read this one that made my heart sink. And it was talking about a US Forest Service master plan update that could include a land exchange. It didn't mention Rollins Pass or Corona Pass specifically, but I just had this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. That feeling wasn't improved when I saw a letter from the town of Fraser around the same time frame discussing that the lands to be exchanged are squarely in the development path and is a logical place for future growth to occur. It just only increased my unease. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the towns of Fraser, it was also Winter Park, the Chamber of Commerce for both towns, the ski resort, the Board of County Commissioners, all of them writing letters of support. And in this case, support isn't a good thing if you are a fan of public lands. This was support for public land to be turned over to a private developer and become private land. So those newspaper articles, those letters of support, they required an advanced knowledge of geography because they weren't speaking Rollins or Corona Pass. East of Beaver, south of Rendezvous, northeast of Lakota, southeast of the town of Winter Park. That's a lot like saying that where we are today is south of Wyoming, west of Kansas, east of Utah. It's accurate, but it isn't specific, and that's also heightened my level of concern. So where was it exactly? This is the entrance to the western portion of Rollins Pass. This would have been an entrance to a private development. Here's an overhead look at that area. So the orange ribbon of road, that is the historic Moffat Road that the train took to get up and over the Continental Divide. It's what you can drive every summer and every fall. The blue line there, that's not water, but it is the waterboard road. That's been there more or less for about 85 years. So a developer was seeking 543 acres of land held by the Forest Service for the development of homes as well as for a considerable amount of road. You can actually see there the road is red. All of that road would be attached to the modern day Rollins Pass Road and really would have taken an eraser to the historic setting and integrity of that road. I'm overlaying now what's in yellow. That is the State Register of Historic Properties boundary. This is an important area according to Colorado history. It's also an important area nationally. I'm painting on the National Register of Historic Places boundaries, as well as this is part of a National Historic District stretching into Gilpin and Boulder counties from Grant County. And then finally, I'm re-accentuating that road because in 2012, Colorado Preservation listed this as one of Colorado's most endangered places. So as board president, I had to get into high gear very quickly and leveraging science and advocacy to fight for our public lands and stirring up quite a bit of good trouble along the way. So I was already writing newspaper articles pushing the fundraiser for Karen Vance's painting, but I was writing additional subtle lines that you may have detected about that the pass is unkind to the developer, as John Rollins and David Moffat learned a century earlier. I also engaged with partners with Colorado State University to conduct a bio-blitz on the western portion of Rollins Pass. If there was to be a development, we need a full understanding about the imperiled and or endangered flora and fauna that would be in that development path. Next, conducting webinars with Dr. Jason LaBelle. He's a professional archaeologist at Colorado State University. He's a friend of the Grand County Historical Association, and he and I presented about the history and the prehistory of this incredible area. These webinars were viewed far and wide. In fact, we had both Gilpin County and Grand County commissioners attending these webinars. So apparently I was turning the corner, stirring up a lot of good trouble, because my phone was ringing off the hook, and I wasn't placing these calls, folks were calling me. I had folks from the U.S. Forest Service, the Grand County commissioners, the land attorney for the proponent, and all of these discussions were civil. One of the hallmarks of alternative dispute resolution is to disagree without being disagreeable. And all of these discussions were jovial and good-natured because we were genuinely trying to understand what each side was trying to get out of this issue. So, one other piece of extra work, I was doing probably 1,000+ hours of additional work trying to fight this land exchange. And I completely filmed, edited, and produced a video, which no one in this room, very few people in this room have seen. So I'd like to play that for you now. Thank you so much. There was a lot of history under threat here, but thankfully everything came to an early conclusion. Kate and I basically guaranteed that that video would have gone viral. It needed to go viral in order to protect that important area. And right as our fingers were hovering over the button to send that out, my phone rang one final time. And it was a Grand County commissioner letting me know, it's over, man. And I wondered what he was talking about. Thank you. And he mentioned that the land exchange had come to an early conclusion. The developer had withdrawn. Public land was safe, once again, in public hands. And let me show you why it came to an early conclusion. Here's that overhead map that I showed a few minutes ago. But here's that same map that proved that there was a roundhouse in Tolland. That same map helped illuminate the developer to the fact that the railroad did not stop at Arrow. It went all the way down to present-day US Highway 40. And once the developer learned that began to change their thought process ever so slightly. One other piece was working with Garrett Briggs. So Garrett Briggs is Colorado's first tribal historic preservation officer. He's a member of the Southern Ute Native American tribe, and unfortunately, working with Garrett, he told me that the Forest Service did not notify any of the Native American tribes about this land exchange, and they view this as a really sacred area. So pulling in Garrett really was crucial to collapsing that land exchange. So those are the stories behind the legends, but there's one more legend that I'd like to introduce you to today, and that is Dana Crawford. For those who don't know Dana Crawford, she is a legend herself. She is instrumental for completely revitalizing lower downtown Denver, from Larimer Square, turning the dilapidated and deteriorating Union Station into Denver's living room with those projects. She got wind of this land exchange and decided to give me a state honor award for those efforts to collapse that land exchange. Thank you. So I wanted to play for you the video that they played earlier this summer at that awards ceremony, because it has audio from Garrett Briggs. It has Dr. Holly Norton, the state archaeologist, talking about the importance of the setting of Rollins Pass and what could have been lost. So here's that video.
We formed Preserve Rollins Pass about a decade ago in order to help best protect the area for future generations. It's an extension of our backyards. It really is home for us. It is basically located directly across from Winter Park Resort. And so this is prime real estate land, and it is a place that is absolutely worth defending.
We can't really just think of it as a site. It's not just one place. It's a web of places that are interconnected through geography and time and people and community.
The Native American game drive systems atop Rollins Pass, these hand-constructed rock walls would suddenly change the migration patterns of animals in order for them to become food or clothing or both.
It really means a lot to Indigenous communities to be able to revisit places that their ancestors inhabited and used, to be able to pass on tribal traditional knowledge to the younger generations and continue to perpetuate our culture into the future.
Nowhere in the country do we see game drives of this size and complexity as we do on Rollins Pass. They're incredible. These rock walls were constructed long before King Tut was ruling in Egypt. In the 1860s, 1870s, John Quincy Adams Rollins built his toll wagon road up and over the Continental Divide and into Middle Park. Then in 1904, David Moffat built his Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific Railway hill route up and over the Continental Divide.
We had people beginning as early as the 1860s coming up with really ingenious ways to get railroads, wagon roads, other sorts of transportation through that pass. Again, about connecting people from one side of the mountains to the other side of the mountains.
A private developer had 2,200 acres of land and was seeking to trade that to the Forest Service in exchange for 543 acres of land directly on the lower portions of the western side of Rollins Pass. I knew that we had a serious problem. Had that land exchange gone through, the literal entrance to the western portion of Rollins Pass would have become an entrance to a private development.
It was immediately apparent not just how much passion Travis had for Rollins Pass, but also how much knowledge he had about its history, about its cultural importance, but also about how historic preservation worked.
I was on a fairly long phone call with the developer. From that, I was able to uncover that there was an understanding on their side that the train stopped at Arrow, when in fact it went all the way down the mountain to present-day US Highway 40. And I think that piece of information began to change their thought process. We're going up against billion-dollar corporations, million-dollar companies. We cannot outspend them, but we can outwork them.
CPI can be there to be that voice for all of us. And I'm always so grateful to the work that CPI does, especially in that advocacy realm.
No site, no landscape, no building is ever saved. But the good news is that if you love a site, you're not alone. There are others who will join in on that journey with you. That's the benefit of working with CPI, and that's how we can help best protect those types of places.
Thank you. So at the awards ceremony that night, I insisted that the MC read a list of folks who helped collapse that land exchange. And I will read that same list as it was read last night, or earlier that summer, because it was so important. So those names are Kate Wright of Preserve Rollins Pass, Kim Grant and Colorado Preservation Inc., Garrett Briggs of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, Amy Webb, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Middle Park chapter of the Great Old Broads for Wilderness, Holly Norton, PhD, State Archaeologist, History Colorado, Shanna Gann, Grand County Historical Association, the Gilpin County Commissioners, the Boulder County Commissioner's Office, Boulder County Parks and Open Space. And it was about at this point that the MC looked at me and said, "You assembled quite the team, didn't you?" And then he continued with Headwaters Trails Alliance, Colorado Wild Public Lands, Colorado State Senator Rankin, Friends of Independence Pass, Jennifer Cook, Colorado State University Extension, Jason LaBelle, PhD, Colorado State University, and David Anderson and Susan Panjabi, Colorado Natural Heritage Program at Colorado State University. It would not have been possible without all of those folks. We did assemble quite the team. And so, as I conclude, the Grand County Historical Association is more than just 4 museums from here to Kremling and events such as this. We're actively out there preserving our history, speaking up for our history, and ensuring that that history has a future here in Grand County. Thank you.
Isn't he amazing? So